joining us.
Thank you, Kojo. It's my pleasure.
And of course, the Congress will be debating the federal budget. John Boehner has a feisty caucus that wants to get rid of Planned Parenthood, and they say if we don't get rid of Planned Parenthood, we're going to shut the government down, and there would affect your constituents, would it not?
Absolutely. It would affect my constituents and many constituents across the Commonwealth and the United States. It's a very, very extreme view. This whole discussion on Planned Parenthood has been hijacked by a very far-right, zealous group that is bound and determined to just simply deny access to reproductive health and abortion services. Planned Parenthood, only 3% of their services are related to abortion. They have come flat out and said they do no tissue donation in Virginia, none. Planned Parenthood, in fact, provides primary and preventive care to thousands of women who otherwise would not have access to care.
But it looked, even before this seismic announcement, it looks like the Republican Senate and the House leadership had worked out a way for there not to be a government shutdown. I think most of the members of Congress on the Republican side know that the shutdown did not make them look well. So there was already apparently going to be some agreement so that the House conservatives can vote against Planned Parenthood, but not at the risk of shutting the government down.
That is not likely to satisfy some of the more determined conservative members, and the informed speculation is that Mr. Congressman Boehner feels that he will be able to avert a shutdown, but that is probably going to lead to a revolt against his leadership that he might not survive.
Maybe there's some thought that Boehner has reached an agreement with some of these most conservative members of the caucus that give me this government extension, I will not run for speaker again, and more importantly, I'll step aside and you guys can fight again in January or whenever the next extension of the government runs out, and then it'll be on the conservatives, see if they can govern, and that would be very interesting. But again, for the 200,000 plus federal workers who work inside the Beltway, for all the people who depend on the federal government to shape their lives, this is a big, big deal on Capitol Hill.
As I said, our guest is Barbara Favola. She's a Virginia State Senator, a Democrat representing the 31st District. If you have questions or comments for Senator Favola, give us a call at 800-433-8850, or even better, go to our website, kojoshow.org, and watch the live video stream and be able to submit your question or comment. That is our website, kojoshow.org. You can send us a tweet at kojoshow or email to kojo@wamu.org. Of course, it was a significant I guess accomplishment in the eyes of Speaker John Boehner that he finally got a sitting Pope to come here. He's invited the last three. This is the first time his invitation has been accepted. So in a way, he's announcing a resignation after what for him is a significant accomplishment.
Both personally and professionally, politically, Boehner, I don't like it, if I may say so. I don't like it the way people make fun of the fact that he's quick to cry as an emotional person. It's a dramatic thing for him. I saw him there sitting behind the Pope in the speech, and people were laughing about, he's crying again. There goes the tearful.
If you watch this video stream long enough, you'll see me cry. But go ahead.
but this is a major personal moment for him, and getting the Pope to come before Congress while he's here for the Philadelphia Family Conference is a big deal. And so I think Boehner can leave, and if he has gotten the conservatives to not shut the government down in his final weeks, he can retire from office and move on to his next phase in life, feeling pretty good about himself. Can you say something nice about the Republicans, like I just said?
If you can't say something nice about Metro.
I do think there are some Republicans who are trying to do the right thing. But again, when you have a very vocal, very extreme group that's sort of taken charge of your party and is willing to fall on their sword for a personal ideological view at the expense of individuals who depend on the federal government, who are, hardworking, who care about creating jobs and are supporting their families. It just looks like people are playing politics with our lives. That, the day-to-day means that a family must use to support themselves just doesn't matter. So it's a terrible message, I think, to send to everybody.
Pope's visit here, Metro worked well. The Pope seemed to get everywhere he needed to go, and everyone else seemed to get everywhere they needed to go, whether on road or on rail or on bus, in fairly good time. The city came through this pretty well.
Yeah, I interviewed the mayor right after the Pope was at the noon prayer at St. Matthew, and she was even then thanked all the city workers who made this happen, not just the fire and police, emergency management people, but the regular workers, the public works people, who all had to be on duty and on guard for anything to happen. I mean, they used the city's salt trucks and as barricades. There was just a lot of coordination. It was inconvenient for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, but overall it went pretty well, and I think that's a testament to the city. Now, of course, there was a lot of liberal leave and people working from home and those types of things, and those people who stayed home, they should know that they contributed to a successful visit because they got to stay home and alter their own lives. I drove through town a lot of times during this visit, and I was pretty well impressed with how the traffic managed this.
Senator Favola, did you come into town at all during that time?
I did not. I participated in the community expectation that we would all work to make this work and make this a pleasant experience. So therefore, I stayed home, and I'm glad Tom made that point. I did have to get around the region, though, although not right into the district. And I just have to say there were far fewer cars, and it took me less travel time. So folks actually were.
That was especially true, it seems to me, on Tuesday and Wednesday, the first 2 days of the Pope's visit here. But
can I add one thing? Some people who support cycling and other modes of transportation other than cars says that if we could just, as a general policy, have 20% of the workforce stay home 1 day a week, that would help, and work from home. That would help alleviate a lot of traffic that we have every day in the nation's capital and in the region.
Just a quick.
I was just going to say more and more companies, and the federal government included, are allowing for telecommuting and seeing incredible benefits. So the workforce of tomorrow, I think, is these young people. They're everywhere with their iPads. Although they're working 24/7, a lot of them don't consider themselves to be employees associated with a certain brick and mortar kind of place.
Senator Favola, you chaired the Women's Reproductive Health Caucus. Last week, the Virginia Board of Health voted to roll back strict regulations put in place 4 years ago on abortion clinics, known as trap laws by opponents. Remind us of what those regulations were and why pro-choice advocates applaud reversing them.
Well, those regulations, in effect, required women's health centers to meet the physical requirements of a hospital. The hallways had to be a certain width. The water fountains had to be a certain height. You needed so many parking spaces. The fact of the matter is that these regulations were very onerous because for women's health centers that were already up and running and already built, to renovate these buildings would have been very costly. And in fact, 2 centers did close because the regulations were so onerous. But the point,
Fairfax City, where were they?
Norfolk and Falls Church. Yeah. But the fact here is, the message here is, those physical regulations had nothing to do with the quality of care provided at these centers. They were not medically necessary. And again, it was a backdoor way to close centers and deny women access to care, reproductive care. And this was again linked back to access to safe abortions.
But here's the problem. These amended regulations still need to be finalized. Do women's health clinics have to worry about the rules changing each time state leadership changes? And can the Virginia General Assembly block these changes?
Well, the regulations have to go through another public comment period, and then, of course, they would find their way, we hope, to the final law. I mean, the final form. Your point is that the law does remain on the books, and there could, in fact, be another bout of regulatory changes if we did have a different governor.
And Attorney General.
I just want to note that even under Cuccinelli, who was
the former Attorney General.
Absolutely. Even under Ken Cuccinelli, the Board of Health had recommended that these regulations not apply to existing centers. And Ken Cuccinelli sort of bullied the Board of Health into changing their position. So if we can get governors who are willing to abide by a very professional and science-based review of their regulations, then the regulations would stay. That's a big if.
Tom?
Well, Governor McAuliffe clearly wanted a change. He has appointments to the board. Mary Margaret Whipple, I think she's on the Board of Health, and you.
I served on the Board of Health before I was a state senator.
Okay, and you succeeded her in the Senate seat.
I did.
Is that correct? Can you get the Board of Health out of politics at all? I mean, I don't know.
Well,
what's in the long term that we were just talking about? I can just see the next governor of Virginia, if it's a conservative Republican, changing again. How do you run a business when you have such a shaky foundation of what the law and regulation is going to be?
Well, the terms of the Board of Health members are staggered, so no governor can come in and do a wholesale reappointment.
And there are 15 members, right?
That's correct. And the tradition in history in Virginia has been that members appointed to the Board of Health have some kind of medical background or expertise in their areas. So people appointed are there to, again, actually make good public policy, to bring a scientific or medical review to the regulations. And that has been the tradition. It could change. A governor could choose to change that, but because the terms are staggered, there's a little buffer against a wholesale review or reappointment process.
And to Kojo's question, can the General Assembly, when it comes into session in January, reverse any moves by the Board of Health?
Well, the General Assembly could, of course. The Board of Health issues regulations based on laws that are passed by the General Assembly and signed by the governor. So the General Assembly, in effect, would end up having to change laws. Anything is possible, but that's why we're working to have balanced government. It's one of the reasons that the Democrats are working so hard to regain control of the state Senate.
This is why politics, on the Politics Hour, this is why politics matters. The person you elect as Attorney General, Governor, or even state senators, where the Senate, the 40-member Senate in Virginia is split, what, 20? It's
19 to 21, 19 Democrats,
right.
21 Republicans.
And so you guys are trying very hard this year to get reelected, and others, how close are you?
Well,
what's your worry as opposed
what's
to
our worry?
All 140 seats in the General Assembly.
140, but
that
there's
is
40
correct.
senators.
40, right.
That is correct. Our worry is that not enough voters will go out and vote. This is an off year. The state Senate is the top of the ticket. Unless voters are extraordinarily engaged in an issue, it is very hard to get them out to the polls. If voters vote, the Democrats will regain control of the Senate. But this is a very tough and challenging year for us.
There's a new poll out today or yesterday from Christopher Newport University that shows that it's the Republicans are slightly ahead in terms of preference statewide, but every race is a local race. It's not just a statewide preference.
Every race is a local race, and if folks really focus on the bread and butter issues like jobs and good quality education, K through 12 education, if they care about the environment, if those issues matter to folks, then they're going to vote. And I would argue they would vote for a Democrat. Certainly, if there's a government shutdown, I think the Republicans would bear more of the blame for that, and rightfully so. And I think that would send the message that absolutely we're not going. We don't care about
Medicaid expansion, since Republicans control both the House and the Senate, and they oppose expanding Medicaid in the state. So the outcome in November could change the odds for Medicaid expansion.
Absolutely. Governor McAuliffe has been very strong and very aggressive about Medicaid expansion, and rightfully so, but he doesn't have any leverage if the Democrats don't have control of one of the chambers, and that chamber has to be the Senate. Medicaid expansion makes perfect sense. It's 400,000 Virginians who are working, and they could be eligible for health care coverage with the federal government paying a large portion of the cost.
Initially.
Even in the long term, Tom. Initially, the federal government was going to cover 100% through 2016, but after that, the federal match won't go down below 90% of the cost. So we were talking about $2 billion coming into the state every year, and possibly 30,000 new jobs. So And I just want to say that Virginians are paying for this anyways. So why would you not, even if you were just looking at it from a purely business model, why would you not move forward with
Because
it?
many of the Republicans don't trust the intents of the federal government.
Well, you know, Medicaid's
But according to the presidential campaign, a lot of people are feeling that way, both liberals and conservatives.
well, Medicaid's been around 50 years and the federal government has never reneged on it. And remember, Medicaid is a state-based program and governors would be lobbying to ensure that the federal match continues. 29 other states have participated. Many of those states are Republican states with Republican governors, and they have gone ahead and participated. And you know, in Virginia, we have hospitals and every major business group begging us to participate in this because the cost of taking care of people who are uninsured is so prohibitive.
From state issues to a very local issue, Senator Favola, an individual who identifies himself as one of your constituents in Arlington says, please ask the senator where she stands on the name of the high school on Stafford Street in Arlington. My son will refuse to accept a diploma bearing the name of a treasonous apologist for slavery who fought and killed to preserve that peculiar and outrageous institution. Fully 1/3 of Arlington's population is African American, some of whom must surely be descendants of slaves. My son would be happy for his diploma to read Washington Grant, but the current name is unacceptable.
What is the name?
I don't know.
It's Washington Lee.
It's the senator's district. She knows.
It's in my district. My son is a graduate of that high school. By the way, it is a first-class high school, and I think the caller would agree to that. That's a very touchy subject. For one, I do not believe that we should have the Confederate flag flying on any state buildings, or that we should give acknowledgement to such a divisive symbol. But the question of whether we actually change every name on every building, I think in highway is to me pretty problematic, because in effect we're denying our history. Now, our history may have been painful, and our history is not something we should always be proud of, but
it is your history.
It is our history, and when we start ignoring that, I think that takes us down a different path, a very dangerous path as well.
And in these places that are named for Confederate soldiers or generals or whomever, it seems to me you can use those as symbols for education. And my thought about the Selma, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, is some people wanted to change the name of that bridge. I said, no, you don't change the name of the bridge. You add explanatory information, marker that says what this is. So you cannot erase all the names, all the highways, the schools. It would just seem to me it sends the wrong message.
I think that's right, and I think that's what the General Assembly is really grappling with. I mean, those of us who are sympathetic to the caller's question are faced with the real possibility of how do you draw the line?
Well, you're going to take down the Washington Monument because he was a slave owner,
right? And so was Jefferson. So was Thomas Jefferson, and we have a monument to Jefferson. So yeah, I think you've hit the complexity of the issue.
Barbara Favola is a Virginia state senator. She's a Democrat representing the 31st district. If you have questions or comments for her, give us a call at 800-433-8850. Would-be Senator Tom Sherwood is our resident analyst. He's a reporter for NBC4 and a columnist for the current newspapers. We mentioned the Pope earlier, but I forgot to mention that if you're hungry for more perspective about the Pope's visit to D.C. and his influence on local communities in Washington, check out the Kojo Nnamdi Show blog at kojoshow.org/blog. There's a short essay up there now by a young Jesuit who's serving his first assignment as a priest at Holy Trinity Catholic Church in D.C. There's also artwork inspired by the memory of Ed Guinan, who Tom knows very well, who is a former Catholic priest who started the Community for Creative Nonviolence, who passed away this year. Check it all out at kojoshow.org/blog. Senator Favola, earlier this week, federal investigators found that the University of Virginia had failed to properly investigate reports of sexual assault and gang rapes, but new campus sexual assault laws went into effect in Virginia in July. What do you think of them? Do you think they'll help campus administrators address this issue on campus in the future? I
hope so. I was one of the chief drafters of the sexual assault bill that did pass the General Assembly, and the governor signed it. What that bill does essentially is it will require now college campuses, when a report of sexual allegation comes to them, when they set up their threat assessment team, which is required under Title IX, when they set up that team, they must have a law enforcement official on that team. So it actually brings the advantage of folks who are schooled and experts in investigating criminal allegations. But they can do this investigation while the privacy of the victim is protected. And that was a big deal, because we found, talking to university officials and mainly talking to advocates and women's groups and actually college students who had been assaulted, that they needed space, they needed privacy, they needed to be able to talk to a counselor without having the decision made immediately that the allegation was going to be turned over to the police. So I think the bill that passed gives the universities another tool, and yet protects that victim. We also, and I should say survivor. So for all of those listening out there, I do know the nomenclature. We also, in that bill, required universities to enter memorandums of understanding with sexual assault centers, so the survivors can get the adequate counseling and other services.
So they're not traumatized twice.
Correct.
The lack of home daycare regulation has received a lot of attention in Virginia after several tragic events in recent years. Earlier this year, you introduced legislation addressing it. Where does that legislation now stand?
Well, we actually got some legislation passed, and my bill was part of the rather omnibus bill that passed in this area. And one of the highlights is, I think your listeners might be very interested in knowing, is if a child daycare home is not licensed, parents have to be informed. It is now a requirement. So we're hoping that, we're trying to use the marketplace as some leverage here, and parents will then take a second or third look. We also lowered the number of children allowed in a daycare center before a licensure requirement kicks in, and we will require background checks. Now it would be 4. It used to be 5. So if you have more than 4, you have to be licensed. There's a lot more to do.
How do you enforce that? How do you enforce that? How do you find out that people are doing daycare illegally when they have 5 children in a home and parents who won't report it?
It is very difficult. Enforcement's very difficult. I will admit a lot of the enforcement takes place at the local level. But the best way, truth be known, is getting the information out there, is making sure that the state website shows what the requirements are, making sure that the local websites show the requirements, making sure that, nonprofit groups can actually show the requirements, because I think the more information parents have, the better choices they will make, and the better able the government will be to in its monitoring position.
Mental health, another area you've worked on, something that has gotten the attention of many since in Virginia's General Assembly, especially since the tragedy with State Senator Creed Deeds' son back in 2013. What's happening now on the issue legislatively?
Well, one of our successes last year is we did get more funding for mental health services, particularly for young people, and that really is a big deal. If we had Medicaid expansion, actually 77,000 Virginians would be eligible for mental health services. At the moment, they needed them. So that's another reason why we should participate in Medicaid expansion. The issue is the state is trying to provide funding for these crises intervention centers. So individuals who are picked up by the police clearly with mental health issues are not taken to an emergency room. They're taken to a nearby crisis center where they can be fully evaluated and perhaps referred to a community-based center for further treatment. It is a challenge. Our system is very fragmented.
I want to go back to what's more raw politics. You've talked about a lot of issues that directly affect women and families, professionally, childcare, all of those issues. But the state of Virginia has not had a statewide African-American or woman in office since Mary Sue Terry, I think, was Attorney General in the early 1980s.
24 years ago.
24 years ago. Already, Attorney General Herring is saying he's going to run for re-election. Ralph Northam, the lieutenant governor, has already announced he's going to run for governor in 2017. There's a lot of swirling around in the political circles about who would be the lieutenant governor candidate for the Democrats in 2017. Your name has been mentioned, and the great mentioner has mentioned your name. What are you saying to people who ask you about that? And I know, let me answer for you first. I've got this first election. I've got to be reelected to the Senate, but I'm going to go beyond that.
Who's the great mentioner? Who's the great mentioner?
Well, the great mentioner is just the scuttlebutt.
Oh, okay. I thought you had an individual in mind.
No, there are many. Well, it's a collective effort.
Thank you.
And I've become part of it by mentioning it. Now let's hear the answer.
Oh, I was quite happy to let you two continue your conversation.
I gave part of the answer. You are focused on winning re-election to the Senate.
I absolutely, and I am focused on helping the Democrats regain control of the Senate. I think that has got to be the absolute first.
The Lieutenant Governor cast the deciding vote in the Senate.
Absolutely.
So
and in most cases, the lieutenant governor, there are 3 exceptions where the lieutenant governor doesn't cast the deciding vote. But it is a very interesting question. Certainly, I think Virginians want to see now a government that reflects the diversity of our fine state, and women have a different life experience than men and have a great deal to bring to the table. So I am very, very interested in seeing a female candidate for lieutenant governor.
So you won't take your name off the list, but you're honored that you're being mentioned.
I could not say that better myself, Tom.
We're running out of time very quickly. And Tom, I think that just about every time he has appeared on this broadcast, Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe, before he left, has said something to us like, feel free to drop by the mansion for a beer. We have never taken him up on that offer, but when he made that offer to like 12,000 people at an international bike race, at least 3 people showed up the next day and said, well, we were invited. We're here. The security didn't think that was such a good idea. But eventually, the people stuck around. The governor came out, invited them in, poured beer for them. Senator Favola, have you ever enjoyed beer at the mansion?
The governor's very generous with his libations. He frequently invites the General Assembly members to the mansion. The governor's a very social being, which I think is an asset in his job. There's not a party in Richmond.
Is the beer any good, or is it cheap beer?
No.
Everything
is top of the line.
I know.
It's a Virginia brewery, and now the big news in this was I didn't know the governor had a kegger in the mansion.
Kegerator. Yeah.
Well, kegger is that's the college name for it.
I didn't know that either, so I just learned something. But I'm
not
not
ask the next time you go.
Surprised.
That's where you want to get your beer
if I were
from.
you,
We'll give them an ad. It's Hardywood Brewer, a brewer in Richmond.
Wow. If I were you all, I would take the governor up on his offer.
They waited 45 minutes.
If he makes an offer, you should take him up on it.
Us, he'll probably have kicked out.
I don't know if he has a beer or two. Does he talk more than he already does? That'd be the question.
Just a little faster.
That's not possible.
Barbara Favola is a Virginia state senator. She's a Democrat representing the 31st District. Senator Favola, thank you for joining us. Good luck in your next election.
Thank you so much.
Do you have a Republican opposition?
I do.
Do you want to say his or her name?
I do not want to say.
Don't you know when a conversation has come to an end?
But I do have an opponent.
I like to go out on
Elections matter. Elections matter. Thank you.
This is the Politics Hour. Tom Sherwood is our resident analyst. He's a reporter for NBC4 and a columnist with the current newspapers. Tom Sherwood, it looks like General Electric may be considering moving to D.C. This, according to someone in Mayor Muriel Bowser's office. Of course, General Electric has offers from several other jurisdictions to go there, but it seems like D.C. is in the running, and one gets the impression that Mayor Bowser is running a fairly aggressive campaign to make it as I guess, easy as possible for major corporations and other large nonprofits to locate here. What's the idea?
Well, the mayor is quite clear that she said it any number of times, she is going to try to push ahead the economic rebirth of the city. It began under the control board and mayors Tony Williams and Adrian Fenty and then Vincent Gray. They all were very aggressive about the economic development of the city, and she has made it clear she wants to do that. The advisory board, which is consulting company just got like a $60 million tax break over 10 years, as long as they increase their employment by 1,000 people. She's done the soccer stadium deal. She's done the Wizards practice thing. And she says this is about getting jobs in the city. There's one good statistics which a lot of people don't know about the district. For decades, there was a statistic that said 70% of the jobs in the city were held by people who lived in the suburbs and for whom we could not tax them.
As a result of which, Ward 2 Council Member Jack Evans.
Can I just say one more thing about that? That number is no longer 70-30. Jeffrey DeWitt, the CFO of the city, says because of the growth of the city, that is now down to 55-45. And that we're getting more people living in the city who are working here. So that's really good news for this district.
So that 45% of the people who work in the city
live in the city.
Yes. At this
point.
And
it used to be 30%.
And DC Councilmember Jack Evans is proposing legislation that new police, teacher, and firefighter hires would have to live in the district. That, on the one hand, would accomplish the objective of having more of those individuals living in the city and therefore feeling a certain affection and loyalty for the city. On the other hand, its opponents claim, do you know how much teachers make when they're starting out? Do you know how much firefighters make when they're starting out? You think somebody who has a family can afford to live in the city on $52,000 a year?
The answer is yes. It may not want to live in all the neighborhoods that they would like to live in, but police officers, I think the starting salary is around $52,000.
Correct.
That may well be good enough if you're a single person or with a couple, but if you have children and need more space, need more money to raise your family, that can be a problem. But the fact is, 40% of the teachers live in the suburbs. 80% of the police officers live in Maryland. And these are all people who are paid by city tax dollars. Jack Evans said, let's wait until January 2017, and so that everyone knows that if you come to work for these agencies, you'll have to live in the city.
Do you also think that legislation may be passed with a caveat that the city structures and provides some assistance for those?
I think that would be absolutely. Even Jack Evans has said the fact that this bill likely won't pass, but if you make some more incentives, worker incentives to give them places, it could work.
Joining us in studio now is Will Jawando. He is a candidate for Congress in Maryland's 8th District. He's an attorney and a former White House aide. Will Jawando, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
If you have questions or comments for Will Jawando, call us at 800-433-8850. If you want to see what he looks like, go to our live video stream at kojoshow.org, where you can also ask a question or make a comment. You can also shoot us a tweet at Kojo Show or email to kojo@wamu.org. You are one of 6 Democrats running to replace Chris Van Hollen in Maryland's 8th Congressional Districts. Several of your opponents not only have fundraising advantages at this point, they've got name recognition, they've held elective office. Why are you running against these people? How do you plan to overcome that?
Well, it may be a little overstated, but first, thank you for having me. I'm glad to join at the lively point of the discussion here. I ran 2 years ago for the State House in a portion of this district, Tacoma Park, Silver Spring, lost by a few hundred votes out of 40,000 cast, less than 1%. So I've got some name.
Who won?
We have a three-tiered system, so
don't waste time.
Yeah. So, but and so we've got some name ID. But to your point of why I'm running, look, I'm born and raised in Silver Spring, Maryland, in the Long Branch area, and grew up at a time when a lot of people didn't want to go to Silver Spring, and have a real lived experience of growing up very low income there. My dad's from Nigeria. My mom is a white woman from Kansas. They settled in this area like a lot of immigrants do, to have new opportunities and job growth and the like. Divorced when I was very young, and I've really been a product of great schools in Montgomery County, both public and private. Was fortunate to get scholarships to Catholic University for undergrad and law school. So I have a deep passion for this area, raising my 3 daughters here now, and we've got some challenges. But the good thing is this seat is wide open for the first time in about 12 years. I think if you did a poll now, no one would have over 10% name ID. Most of the time, people don't know who their local state reps and senators are, and especially in a presidential year, I think it's wide open. So I think I'm excited about it.
And one way you get your name out is to have a well-funded campaign.
Yep.
In the last fundraising report, State Senator Jamie Raskin and Kathleen Matthews, a former Marriott executive and TV anchor, each announced that they had raised 5 times as much money as you, well over 500,000, and you were at 112. You have another campaign finance reporting date coming up next Wednesday.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us a hint of how well you're doing money-wise, if not an exact number so far?
Great question. As a good reporter would ask, we're heading in the right direction. I think what you'll see, likely, I don't know what other candidates have.
And excuse me, the reason I'm asking this because Valerie Irvin was in this campaign and she dropped out and she complained that one of the big troubles was she could not raise money to be a credible candidate.
That's exactly right. And it is a big problem. People are fed up with money being the determining factor and access to wealth and wealthy people being the ones that can get their message out there. And it served as a detriment for women and people of color for running. That being said, our fundraising is going up. We'll have a higher number than we did last quarter. I can tell you that.
You better.
and we're heading in the right direction. I think you'll see some of my opponents dip a little bit because they had some and we only had about 6 weeks to raise in that first quarter. And the goal here is to raise enough funds to make sure we get our message out. And there's a lot of ways to do that through social media, through online, and we'll have those resources. If you think back to when Chris Van Hollen first beat Mark Shriver 12 years ago, he was outspent 3-1, a little over $3 million.
That's what I'm thinking, because pundits are saying that it's going to take between $1 and $3 million to run a competitive race. But I suspect that depends on how you intend to organize your campaign, or do you think that you have to raise that kind of money?
I think our goal is to raise over $1 million, and I think you'll need somewhere around there to compete. You'll have others that'll raise more, but your point is exactly right, Kojo. How you organize it, the operation you have on the ground, the type of earned media and social and digital. A lot of people, one thing unique about our district, and I'm part of this population, 33% of the registered Democrats are under 40. A lot of working families.
How much under 40 are you?
I'm 32.
Okay.
So I'm an old millennial, if you've ever heard that term. And so a lot of people consuming media on their phones and on through other social media. So we have a very aggressive plan there. And my plan is, in a race like this with 6 people, you just have to get your message out and target your votes. And it's a message that I think will resonate.
Let's talk about that message for a second, because you've got a range of progressive issues in your platform, things like raising the minimum wage, action on the environment, paid sick leaves. Which of those issues you're going to prioritize in this campaign?
Yeah, great question. And my candidacy is all about being a candidate of, by, and for the people. It's something that I think has been lost in modern day politics. We have a lot of politicians who are millionaires, who have access to a lot of wealth. I grew up very low income in this district. That's why when I talk about things like affordable childcare, I understand. When my mom struggled to get that for me, I have 3 young daughters. We struggle even now to do that, and are making decent wages. So we have to expand things like childcare. We have to close achievement gaps in education. We have to make college affordable. If we're really going to make sure that people can go to school and get the training and education they need to succeed. Too many in my district and across the country are caught in kind of this trap where you're working harder for less. Wealthy elites seem to be rigging the game, corporations, and people are frustrated. And especially in my generation, but this is for all people, are cynical with the process. And what I hope to do is say that from my experience working in government, but not being elected, but knowing how government works, having been a staffer on the Hill for 6 years and then at the White House and Department of Education.
Somebody might say you're part of the problem.
Well, I'm just enough a part to know how it works and how it doesn't work.
Who are you supporting for president?
I have not made a determination on that. I think we have got some good candidates in the race. Secretary Clinton is certainly among them. I've worked with Senator Sanders when I served on the Help Committee. Senator Sherrod Brown and Senator Obama. They sat right next to him, so I worked with him closely. And Governor Martin O'Malley is a good candidate. So haven't made a determination. I'm worried about my race. I've got 6 months. So
you mentioned education as one of your top issues in your experience working in Congress and at the White House. You want to increase access to early childhood education, as well as advocating college for all. Who's going to pay for that? How will it work?
Well, I'll answer your question, Kojo, but the answer is we have to pay for it. I'll tell you right here today, if I didn't have access to early childhood education, if I wasn't afforded scholarships, I had one of my best friends when I was 12 years old shot and killed who didn't have access to these things in my neighborhood. A seminal moment for me. The question is not who's going to pay for it. The question is, if we don't pay for it, are we paying for it on the back end through the criminal justice system? We know the stats about how much it takes to incarcerate rather than educate. And that achievement gap that people like to talk about starts at kindergarten. When my daughters, who have been in early childhood education since 2 years old, get to kindergarten and have 3 million more words than the kid in Long Branch who hasn't had that access. So it's through to your question. You have taxes that need to be raised on the wealthy. And it's an investment. It's not a taking. It's an investment on the back end. And I think that people are starting to see that in cities across the country, in states across the country, where that's an early childhood.
Speaking of early childhood education, I had the opportunity to be at the Mary McLeod Bethune Academy this morning, where I was able to watch 3-year-olds, Tom, in language immersion classes in which they were being spoken to, and these are English speakers, exclusively in Spanish.
On mobile devices or by real teachers?
In person, in real teachers, and responding to those teachers and being corrected and understanding everything that was being said. For me, it was amazing. You also aim, oh, by the way, our guest is Will Jawando. He's a candidate for Congress in Maryland's 8th District. He's an attorney and a former White House aide. If you have questions or comments for him, you can call us at 800-433-8850 or send email to kojo@wamu.org. You want to reform high-stakes testing, and that's a hot-button issue. What alternative are you proposing?
Well, there's no silver bullet there. Look, we need tests to be able to assess how student growth over time. I've worked at the Department of Education. I've dedicated my life to education because it's the great equalizer. And
you were at the Department of National. What did you do there?
I was an advisor to the secretary. I helped create public-private partnerships to get business and philanthropy to invest in education early on.
Okay, good.
Yeah, no problem. And so we need testing, but what we need is good tests. We need tests that assess formative thinking and high-order thinking skills. And we need teachers that have the professional development and the time to learn how to administer those tests and have the freedom within that to be innovative. We don't want to hamstring teachers, have them teach the test scared to move off the
Would you dump Common Core?
I think Common Core is the step in the right direction. It was agreed to by governors.
44 of them, I think.
Yeah,
so.
and it says a basic premise that if you're a 4th grader in Massachusetts, your math education should be the same as a 4th grader in Mississippi. And I don't want to go back to the days when that could be unequal. If you leave it to the states, and there's not this common curriculum, I think you could have that issue. But one thing I do want to say is that, people need to participate in the process. And I think why you have a lot of people that are cynical nowadays is that feel that things are being imposed upon them. They don't have a say. And that's part of what we're trying to do in our campaign is say, hey, look, everyone should be included. We should have an inclusive democracy where decisions are made with and for teachers in this example, but in a number of other examples too.
When we were talking with Senator Favola, the issue of Confederate names came up. Montgomery County is also debating this issue. County Executive Isaiah Leggett wants to move a statue of a Confederate cavalry private, which now stands next to the red brick courthouse in downtown Rockville. It's a local issue, but it is in the 8th Congressional District that you are running for. What is your feeling about it?
Well, I went and made comments to the Rockville City Council when this was being first debated. I think it's a serious issue. It's something that needs to be looked at. I was so supportive and was in tears. You talked about John Boehner crying when they removed this Confederate flag from the South Carolina Capitol because of the symbol of hatred and bigotry that was, and to be on state grounds. I think in this scenario, I'm fine with us moving it. But what I'm more focused on is education around where we've been in our country and the history and the legacy of slavery, which is still manifest today in the form of mass incarceration and an increasing segregation in our schools. So I want to talk about the issues and the legacies of slavery and why that war was fought and what we're still dealing with, as opposed to a statue.
Not the symbols, but the substance.
Exactly. Symbols are important, but I think substance is more important.
Well, one major issue which only bubbles up occasionally and then seems to get pushed down by the general politics of the nation is, what do you do about the fact that slavery was so horrible in this country? Some people have, for decades have said there ought to be reparations. Is that something that's within your framework?
Yeah, there, as I said, from the legacy of this country is the legacy with race is one from chattel slavery to Jim Crow, to now mass incarceration. They're cousins. There's a direct line. And to say that you can address those without addressing systemic things, you don't have to call it reparations, but we need to invest in education. We need to make sure that underserved communities have the resources they need to succeed. We need to make sure that all kids have access to health care.
So in the district, the mayor is creating the school specifically for young men of color who need more work than just a nice school education academically. That's one thing you could do.
Yeah, I think I'm supportive of programs that are innovative, that give. I'm a young man of color. One of the best things that ever happened to me was my 4th grade math teacher at Oakview Elementary in Montgomery County, the only African American teacher I ever had in my over 20 years of education, who taught me how to tie a tie, how to do simple things, and gave me some things that are invaluable to me 20 plus years later. So I think,
what was that teacher's name?
Mr. Williams.
They always remember the name of the teacher.
I've tried to. I went to so many different schools. And I'd have to fill a football field with names.
On to the phones. Here's Damon in Wheaton, Maryland. Damon, you are on the air. Go ahead, please.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon to the candidate.
Good afternoon.
I have a question for you, sir. So back in August, State Attorney General Brian Frost released guidelines around racial profiling in the state of Maryland. My question for you would be whether or not those guidelines that were issued to stem racial profiling by law enforcement go far enough to address the fractures between communities of color, primarily the Black community, and law enforcement. And if they don't, what steps do you see needing to be taken by folks in positions of power to address these issues?
Thank you, Damon. Great question. I think it was a good first step. They are, as with all guidelines, they're guidelines, and folks don't have to necessarily abide by them. I think we need legislation, both federally and at the state level. Obviously, I'm running for Congress, that makes racial profiling illegal and increases training for officers. There's this idea of implicit bias that people, even well-intentioned people, don't know when they're being discriminatory. There's a reason an officer pulls his gun 3 or 4 times faster for a Black assailant than he does a white. And that you need to break down those barriers. And we need more training. We need more focus on community policing. And we need to obviously make sure on the accountability side that those things are outlawed. I'd also say, we need more representative democracy. People making these decisions need to look like their community. They need to have input on these community review boards. And there needs to be more of a focus on rehabilitation.
You wrote an editorial in August for The Root about why Black men have reason to fear the police. And you spoke from personal experience. But when I read that editorial, the personal experience that you had, you and your friends really messed up is what it was, because you were riding apparently in a car with somebody who made a lewd and profane remark to a woman who turned out to be an undercover police officer. And as a result, you got arrested. Talk about that.
When was this?
Law school over 10 years ago, 11, 12 years ago.
I thought you were asking about the Colorado incident.
Yeah,
this one sounds much more interesting.
No, the Colorado incident, and that's it's a fair point there, Tom. I've had many interactions with law enforcement where I've had thought about running. The one I highlight in this article, while a mistake by my friend, and while the charges were dropped and nothing, and then later suppressed the arrest, is an example of the psyche and the trauma that many African Americans feel when they are encountered by the police. You wanted to run? Yeah, wanted to run. 1 in 2 African Americans in this country, by the time they reach the age of 23, have been arrested. That is something that is a
1 in 2?
1 in 2. So that means Kojo or I. We know who the one is here. I don't know about Kojo, but it's
you're up, baby.
Yeah, there you go. And so not everyone's able to navigate that process. The long-term effects on being able to get a job. The point is, people make mistakes, and sometimes and they should be able to get back into society. Everything shouldn't be a crime the way it is. The president's talked about this. He's grown up in a more forgiving environment. Mm-hmm. And often for too many people of color, you're locked out of opportunity before you can even get started. So I wanted to talk about that psyche.
We only have about a minute left, huh?
Well, the 8th district is changing dramatically. The schools have 100 different languages in them. Why is it that you can do better than Kathleen Matthews, who has a career of being in the public eye, Jamie Raskin, who has extensive support background and all the liberal issues that you
Yeah,
can think of, plus serving in the legislature. And Chris Van Hollen actually served in the legislature before he got elected to Congress. This would be your first public job, right, as an elected person.
Well, as an elected, but I served in Congress.
So why would you be better than these other candidates, which we didn't mention them all because you only have less than a minute?
Sure. Because I have lived experience. I grew up in this community. I know what it takes to grow up and succeed in this community. I'm raising my children there. I've worked in Congress. You need to know how Congress works. It's not a state legislature. We saw today the steps that John Boehner took to right the ship at a dysfunctional Congress. And I'm also from a generation that understands that while we may be cynical about government, there's things we can do to fix it. And you need people that can get in there and work very hard to do that. And for all people in the district, not just some. I'm the only African-American running in this race, which is important, not just for that reason, but because we need inclusive democracy.
Will Jawando, he's a candidate for Congress in Maryland's 8th District. He's an attorney and a former White House aide. Thank you for joining us.
I appreciate you having me. Hope you have me back.
Tom Sherwood is our resident analyst. He's a reporter for NBC4 and a columnist with the current newspapers. Yes, I was arrested as a teenager, but it was another country.
There we go.
Thank you all for listening. I'm Kojo Nnamdi. Coming up Monday on the Kojo Nnamdi Show.